I'm Marlowe Merritt, and I was 36 years old the afternoon my family drove 4 hours to divide a brewery they had no idea I already owned. But this story really starts 11 years before that, on a Tuesday in November, when my father called to tell me the family business was going to my younger brother instead of me, and asked if I'd be willing to train him. If a story like this finds you tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. And if it hits home, please subscribe so the next one reaches you too. These days I start my mornings at 5 with a cup of coffee I grind myself, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of a converted grain mill on the edge of a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. Below me, through 4 inches of original cast-iron framed glass, I can see 60-barrel fermentation tanks catching the gray morning light. Stainless steel, temperature-controlled, spotlessly clean. The kind of equipment that costs more than most people's houses. My head brewer, Petra, is already down there checking the gravity on a barrel-aged stout we've been conditioning for 8 months. She's 27, meticulous to the point of obsession, and the most talented fermentation mind I've encountered in 15 years in this industry. She showed up 3 years ago with a notebook full of recipe ideas and an argument for why I should hire her that lasted 45 minutes without repetition. I hired her on the spot. The building is 4 stories of reclaimed brick and old-growth timber. Taproom on the ground floor with 40 taps and a kitchen that seats 120. Production on the 2nd and 3rd. My office on the 4th, glass-walled, overlooking the whole operation like a bridge over a ship I still can't believe I'm allowed to captain. I didn't inherit any of it. I didn't marry into it. I didn't win it. I built it with a severance check, a second mortgage on a small house I no longer own, and about 11 years of working harder than I have ever worked at anything, including working at the family business I wasn't good enough to inherit. That part comes first. The Merritt family ran a regional food distribution company out of a mid-sized city in Ohio. My grandfather Harold started it hauling produce in a refrigerated panel truck in 1961. By the time my father, Dennis, took over in the mid-80s, it had grown into a respectable regional operation. Contracts with grocery chains, a fleet of trucks, a warehouse the size of a city block, and about 200 employees who'd worked there long enough to remember Harold's handshake deals. I grew up knowing the business the way you know the weather in a place you've always lived. It was everywhere and assumed. At the dinner table, at every holiday, in every conversation that went longer than 10 minutes. Merritt Family Distribution was not just where my father worked. It was the organizing principle of the family's entire identity. There were 4 of us. My father Dennis, my mother Carolyn, my brother Griffin, 2 years younger, and me. And here is the thing I want to say plainly without bitterness, because I've had 11 years to understand it clearly. I was not the golden child. I don't mean that the way it sounds in a lot of these stories, where the person saying it is clearly the smart one who was overlooked for shallow reasons. I mean it in a more complicated, more honest way. Griffin was charming in a way I was not. He was easy in rooms where I was precise. He remembered people's names and their kids' names and their dogs' names, and he made them feel, in the way that some people effortlessly can, that they were the most interesting person he'd spoken to all week. I was competent. I was methodical. I could run a logistics operation in my sleep by the time I was 25, and I had the spreadsheets to prove it. And I handed them to people who smiled and said, "Great work, Marlowe," and went to find Griffin at the bar. I joined the family business at 22, right out of college. Operations coordinator, then logistics manager, then regional VP by 28. I worked long hours and I solved problems, and I did not ask for recognition because I had been raised, in the same quiet, insidious way that a lot of eldest daughters are raised, to understand that my value was in my usefulness, not in being celebrated for it. My mother, Carolyn, was not a cruel woman. I want to be clear about that. She was something more mundane and in some ways more damaging. A woman who had decided, early and completely, that Griffin needed her more than I did. And she was not entirely wrong that Griffin needed more. He was impulsive where I was cautious, emotionally volatile where I was steady, and he made bad decisions with reliable creativity. What she was wrong about was the conclusion she drew from that. That because I needed less, I needed nothing. That because I didn't ask, I didn't want. That because I kept going when things were hard, it didn't cost me anything to keep going. The strong one, the capable one, the one who'd figure it out. I have come to believe that this is one of the quiet injustices most families visit on the daughter who holds things together. They build the whole load-bearing wall of their expectations out of that daughter's back, and then act genuinely puzzled when she eventually walks out the door. I didn't walk out the door for a long time. I stayed and I worked and I waited because I believed, with the stubbornness that has always been my defining characteristic, that good work would eventually speak for itself. It didn't, or rather, it did, and what it said turned out not to be what I'd hoped. Let me take you back to the Tuesday in November when it started. Not the end of this story, the beginning of the real one. I was 25. I had been at Merritt Family Distribution for 3 years, long enough to have restructured the entire routing system and saved the company roughly $400,000 in fuel costs annually, a number that sounds impressive because it was. I had not received a raise commensurate with that contribution. I had received a framed certificate that said excellence in operations, which I accepted with a straight face and put in a drawer. My father called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of meeting that has no agenda on the calendar, which is always the sign that the agenda is something no one wanted to write down. He was 60 then, a year out from a minor cardiac event that had made him newly philosophical about legacy and succession, and what he called making sure the right people were in the right seats before the music stopped. He told me the business would eventually need someone at the helm with Griffin's relational skills. He told me that the trucking industry, the distribution world, it ran on relationships. He told me that Griffin had a gift for relationships. He told me all of this in the careful, measured tone of a man who has rehearsed an argument many times because he knows it doesn't fully hold. Then he asked if I'd be willing to mentor Griffin, to help bring him up to speed on the operational side, so that when the time came, Griffin would have a strong second in command, meaning me to run the numbers while Griffin ran the rooms. I sat in that chair and I did the thing I always did. I kept my face level. I did not cry. I did not argue. I asked a few clarifying questions in a tone that gave nothing away. Then I drove home and sat in my kitchen for about 4 hours and let myself feel, for the first time in adult memory, what it was like to finally understand that the thing you've been working toward was never on the table. I am not going to tell you I handled the next several years with grace. I didn't entirely. I stayed. I trained Griffin, who was not stupid, just uninterested in the precise technical work that actually made the company run, and who knew that I'd pick up whatever he let drop, because I always had. I watched promotions go sideways and announcements get made in rooms I wasn't in. I watched Griffin get the corner office and the company truck and the box seats at the Indians games, the whole performance of succession. And I sat 3 desks over and kept the machine running. What I did with my anger quietly was the thing that changed everything. I started going to a local homebrew club on Thursday nights. I want you to understand how small that sounds and how completely it redirected my life. I'd started brewing at home as a hobby the year before, on a whim, a 5-gallon starter kit from a homebrew shop. I wasn't looking for a passion. I wasn't aware that I didn't have one. I was looking for something that was entirely mine, something with no Merritt name on it, something where my father's opinion and my brother's charm and my mother's scorekeeping had no jurisdiction whatsoever. The homebrew club met in the back room of a bar called the Rusty Nail, 9 or 10 people around folding tables, talking about fermentation chemistry with an intensity that embarrassed me at first and captivated me within a month. I discovered that I was, without exaggeration, unusually good at this. Not because I had a particularly refined palate, though I developed one. Because I had a systems brain. Because I understood tolerances and process optimization at a cellular level from years in logistics. Because I could look at a recipe and see the variable interactions the way other people looked at a map and saw roads. I started winning competitions inside of a year. Regional, then national-level homebrew competitions, first in the pale ale categories, then the experimental bracket, then a best in show at a national amateur invitational that got me a write-up in a trade magazine that my family never read. I had found the thing that fit my mind the way the work at Merritt never had, and I was doing it in complete secrecy, the way you protect something you're not sure you're allowed to have yet. Here is when I should tell you about the money. I am not a flashy person. I drive a truck that is 6 years old. I own one good blazer. I do not have a particularly strong opinion about watches or the kind of restaurants where the menu has no prices. Money to me has always been a tool for building things rather than a scorecard, And so for the entirety of my career at Merritt Family Distribution, I had been quietly and systematically saving in a way that my family, had they thought to ask, would have found startling. I lived in a small house I'd bought young and paid down aggressively. I had no debt other than the mortgage. I cooked at home. I did not take expensive vacations. I had no interest in the performance of wealth, only in the accumulation of the real thing. By the time I was 33, still working at Merritt, still training Griffin, still running the numbers while my brother ran the rooms, I had something close to $400,000 in liquid savings and a house I could borrow against. I also had a plan. Not a sudden plan, not a dramatic plan. The kind of plan that grows so slowly you don't notice it becoming a plan until the day you sit down and realize you've been building it for years. I had been researching the craft brewing market for 18 months. I had a business model. I had 3 years of competition wins as market validation. I had identified a property, an abandoned grain elevator and mill complex on the edge of the urban core of a mid-sized city in Washington state. Far from Ohio, far from the Merritt name, far from a dinner table where my triumphs were invisible. The city had a young demographic, an established beer culture, and a gap in the premium production brewery segment that a careful market analysis made embarrassingly clear. I had a number. The property was listed for $900,000. Between my savings, a second mortgage on the house, and a small business administration loan that my credit score made available to me, the advantage, the one true advantage of years of quiet financial discipline, I could make the purchase and fund the initial build-out. I had 1 year's living expenses in reserve. I had never told anyone. I want to sit with that for a second, because people always ask why I didn't tell my family. The honest answer has 2 parts. The first part is that I knew, with the quiet certainty you develop about people after decades of careful observation, that telling my family would not produce support. It would produce concern dressed as love. It would produce suggestions that I stay, that I wait, that the timing wasn't right, that Griffin was going to need me, that Dad's health was uncertain. It would produce the full architecture of a family that had organized itself around keeping me in my support role, deployed against the first genuine exit I'd ever attempted. The second part is simpler. This was mine. For the first time in my adult life, something was entirely mine, and I was not going to hand it to the committee until the foundation was already poured. I gave my notice on a Monday in March. I said I was pursuing a business opportunity out of state, which was true, and I declined to say more, which was my right. And I endured a family dinner the following Sunday where my mother cried a little and my father looked at me the way people look at someone making a choice they find baffling. And Griffin said, genuinely confused, "What are you even going to do out there, Mar?" I told him I'd let them know when I was settled. Then I packed a moving truck, sold the Ohio house, closed on the grain mill property in Washington on a Tuesday, and began the second half of my life. The first year was not romantic. I want to say that clearly because these stories sometimes get polished into something cleaner than the truth. The grain mill was a wreck. It had been empty for 11 years, and buildings do not wait patiently for you. The roof had 3 soft spots that the inspector had noted and I had underestimated. The electrical was a generation behind code. The freight elevator, which I needed to move equipment between floors, required a complete rebuild that ate 6 weeks and $30,000 I had not planned for. I was living in a studio apartment 4 blocks away. I was on site every day by 6 and off the site by dark and back at my laptop until midnight. I managed the general contractor relationship, which is a polite way of saying I was on the phone arguing about timelines every other day. I sourced used equipment from closing breweries, because the craft beer consolidation wave of that era was producing a secondary market of quality stainless steel that I was positioned to exploit if I was fast. I filed permits and chased inspections and learned more about commercial plumbing than I ever wanted to know. I had no employees yet, I had no taproom, I had no revenue. What I had was a feeling I had not experienced in 33 years of life. The feeling of being in the right place. It didn't feel like success. It felt like alignment. The way I imagine a compass feels when it finally points north. I called my parents on Sundays. Short calls, warm but not detailed. My mother wanted to know when I was coming home for the holidays. My father wanted to know if I needed anything, which was his way of asking without asking whether I'd made a mistake. Griffin texted occasionally, usually to ask logistics questions about the family business that I answered because I couldn't not, the muscle memory of usefulness too deep to override. I told them I was working on a restaurant concept. Technically true, the taproom would have a full kitchen. I was not ready for the full story, and honestly, they had not yet asked a direct enough question to require it. 16 months after I arrived in Washington, on a gray October afternoon, I opened the taproom doors for the first time. I had 7 beers on tap. I had a kitchen serving elevated pub food. I had a front-of-house manager named Rosario who'd been running bars for 15 years, and who had a gift for making every person who walked through the door feel like a regular. I had Petra, just hired, who had already told me in her characteristically direct way that 3 of my 7 house recipes needed adjustment, and who had been correct about all 3. I had 43 people walk through the door on opening day. Not a stampede, not a viral moment. A Tuesday afternoon trickle of curious locals and a few food writers. I'd done the quiet work of building relationships with over the preceding months. By Friday, we were full. By the following month, the wait for a table on weekends was 90 minutes, and I had a list of people who wanted to pick up crawlers at the counter. By the end of the first year, we had won 2 awards at a regional brewing competition, been written up in both the major regional food publication and a national craft beer magazine, and grossed just over $2 million in taproom revenue. I want to be clear about what I felt, and I want to be honest that it was not pure triumph. It was mostly disbelief. The specific disbelief of a person whose ceiling has been defined by other people's expectations for so long that she has partially internalized those limits. The specific disbelief of a person who has finally broken the surface and is still not completely certain the air is real. I was a woman running a successful brewery in a converted grain mill on the other side of the country from everyone who had ever told me, not with words but with every decision they made, that I was the supporting character in a story that belonged to someone else. And I still hadn't told my family what I'd built. Here is the moment that changed the shape of what comes next. I was in my 4th year at the brewery. We had expanded, a second taproom location across town, a small canning line, a distribution contract with 3 regional grocery chains. The original building had been refinanced, the SBA loan paid off, the second mortgage retired. The property had been appraised in the current market at just over $4 million. The business itself, as a going concern, was worth considerably more. I was 36. I was not rich in the way that people who talk about money on the internet mean. I was asset-rich and operationally focused, and I still drove a 6-year-old truck. But the scale of what I'd built had become something I could not entirely hide anymore, because it was winning awards in publications with national reach, and the internet is not a private place. My brother Griffin found it. He texted me on a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday in these moments, I've noticed, with a screenshot of a trade magazine article. There was a photo of me in front of the fermentation tanks and a headline I won't quote because of how it reads now that I know what came next. The article described the brewery, the revenue figures we disclosed publicly in a small business profile, and some context about the building and its appraised value. Griffin's text said, Mar, why didn't you tell us? And then before I could respond, Mom is going to lose her mind. He was right about that second part, though not in the way he meant. My mother called within the hour. She was warm. She was so warm. She told me she was so proud of me, and the warmth was real. I want to say that. I don't think the pride was entirely performance. My mother was not a pure villain in this story, and I would be doing her a disservice to make her one. But underneath the warmth, before the call was 3 minutes old, the structure was there. The familiar structure. The scaffolding of a family that has always treated me as a resource rather than a person. She said, we need to come see it, the whole family. Wouldn't that be wonderful? She said. Griffin has been struggling, you know. The business has had a hard couple of years. Your father's getting older. She said, I've always thought a Merritt should have their name on something like this. And there it was. The move I'd seen 1,000 times at the family dinner table. The reframing of my accomplishment as a family asset. My name becoming our name before the ink on the magazine profile was dry. I told her I'd love for them to visit. I meant it. The visit was not the problem. What I heard in the spaces between what she said was the rest of it. Griffin's struggling. The family business has had hard years. And now here you are with something worth $4 million. I knew that arithmetic. I'd sat in a lot of kitchens with that arithmetic. I said, come whenever you'd like, And I hung up and sat with the feeling for a while. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Ren Nakashima. She has been my business attorney since year 2, when I realized that the level of contract work I was doing required someone better than the generalist I'd started with. She is precise and fast, and has a particular way of listening that communicates, without a word, that she has already seen how this ends and is waiting for you to catch up. I told her about my family. Not everything, not the childhood architecture of it, but enough. The distribution company, the succession that went sideways, the brother who got the business, the phone call with my mother and what I heard in the negative spaces. I told her I was concerned that my family was going to arrive at some point with expectations about the brewery that I wanted to be ahead of. She asked a few precise questions. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has anyone in your family ever contributed capital or labor to this business?" "No," I said. "Has anyone co-signed any debt instruments or provided any financial guarantees?" "No." "Is the property held solely in your name?" "Yes." "Is the business entity structured with you as sole member?" "Yes." Then she said, with the mildness of someone delivering a fact, "You don't have a legal problem, Marlowe. You have a family dynamics problem. Those are different things. The first one I can solve for you in an afternoon. The second one is yours to manage." She was right. She has been right about most things. What I asked her to do was prepare a complete document package. Ownership structure, property deed, business entity formation documents, the full chain of title on the building, every financial record that established, unambiguously and without gap, that this business had been built entirely by me with my money, my credit, my labor over 11 years of work. That there was no inheritance in it. No family money. No Merritt name on any founding document. Nothing that could be confused, even by people who were motivated to confuse it. She had it ready in a week. I put it in a folder and I put the folder in my office safe. Then I waited to see what my family would do next. It took 6 months. In those 6 months, the calls from home increased. My mother, who had been a Sunday call person for years, became a 3 times a week person. The calls were warm and the questions were on the surface innocent. "How's business? How's the building holding up? Have you thought about expansion? Have you thought about bringing in a partner?" That last one landed softly, like a suggestion about dinner, but I knew how to hear it. My father called once, a rarity, to tell me that Griffin had gone through a difficult period. A business decision that hadn't worked out. Nothing catastrophic, but the company had taken on some debt and the operational side was strained. He said it the way he'd always said things that were meant to move me to action, obliquely, leaving the conclusion for me to draw, so that when I drew it, it would feel like my own idea. Griffin texted a few times. "Hey, can we talk sometime?" And then when I said sure, going radio silent for 2 weeks, which was how Griffin communicated that a hard conversation was building. He was working up to something. I'd watched him do it all my life. The hard conversation came on a Thursday evening in early spring, when Griffin called and stayed on the phone for 45 minutes. He told me about the company debt. He told me that Dad was thinking about bringing in outside investors to stabilize things, but that Mom hated that idea, hated the thought of outside ownership in a Merritt business. He told me he had been thinking, and here his voice got careful and warm the way my mother's had gotten warm on that first call, that maybe there was an opportunity for the family to come together. The brewery was doing so well. The distribution company had infrastructure that could help the brewery scale nationally. There was a synergy there. He actually used the word synergy. I asked what he was proposing specifically. He said, "I don't know, maybe an investment, maybe a partnership. Mom thinks it would be good for the family to have something together." I said, "I appreciate you sharing that, Griffin. Let me think about it." I had already thought about it. The answer was no. It would always be no. Not out of spite, though I would not have blamed anyone who heard this story, and concluded that spite was reasonable. The reason was that I had spent 36 years watching what happened to things I built when the Merritt family decided they had a stake in them. The reason was that my brewery was the first place I had ever worked where my name was on the front door, and the credit went to no one but me. But I didn't say no yet. I said let me think about it, which was true in the sense that I was already thinking about how to handle what I now believed was coming. Because here is what I had picked up in the frequency of those calls, in the careful language, in the architecture of a family that had always moved on me sideways rather than directly. They were not coming to invest. They were coming to claim. I didn't know yet exactly how, I didn't know the specific shape of it. But I knew my family, and I knew that the moment they had identified an asset, the next move was to establish proximity to it. Sure enough, 3 weeks later, my mother called to tell me they were all coming for the 4th of July weekend. All of them. Dennis and Carolyn, Griffin and his girlfriend Amber, and my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Patris, who ran a small accounting firm back in Ohio, and whom my mother always brought to meetings she was trying to make feel official. She said, "We'd love to see the brewery, of course, and spend some time together as a family. And we thought it would be a good opportunity to sit down and talk about the future." The future. I said, "I would love to have you. I'll make sure you have a wonderful visit." And I meant it, in the same way I imagine a chess player means it when they invite their opponent to make the move they've been waiting for. I want to tell you about the 4th of July weekend first from the inside, what the family saw, and then from the outside, which is what was actually happening. What they saw: a thriving brewery, beautifully restored, busy every day of the long weekend, with exactly the kind of crowd that makes a family with inheritance on their mind start quietly calculating. They saw Petra running the production floor with the confidence of someone who has no patience for amateurs. They saw Rosario working the tap room like a conductor. They saw my name on the building. They saw what $4 million in real estate looks like when someone has poured 11 years of care into it. My mother spent the first evening walking the building the way she used to walk the distribution warehouse, with her hands behind her back, assessing, cataloging, doing a mental inventory of what belonged to the family and what was still being negotiated. Griffin was more charming about it. He leaned on the bar and talked to customers, and I watched him do what he'd always done, make rooms like him. And I noticed, for the first time in my life without rancor, that his gift and my gift were genuinely different, and that his gift was not more valuable than mine just because it was more visible. It had taken me a long time to understand that. Aunt Patris asked to see the business financials on the second day. She framed it as curiosity. She said she always loved seeing how creative businesses structured themselves. She pulled out a legal pad. I told her warmly that the financials were confidential, but that I'd be happy to share our publicly available revenue disclosures. She made a note on her pad with the speed of someone who has already found what she was looking for and is writing down the number. My father took me for a walk on the third evening the way he'd always communicated the important things in motion, not sitting down. We walked along the river path near the building as the sun got low. He said, "Mar, I want to say something." I waited. He said, "I didn't handle the succession right. I've thought about that a lot." I looked at him. Something in my chest moved. He'd never said it. In 11 years, he had never once said it directly. He said, "Griffin has been struggling. The company has been struggling. And I look at what you've built here and I think about how the family has more than one kind of asset, and it seems like a shame for them not to work together." And there it was again. The apology in the first sentence, the ask in the second. The same move he'd been making my whole life, so smoothly I'd spent years mistaking the apology for the point, when the apology was just the wrapper around the ask. I said, "I hear you, Dad. Let's all sit down tomorrow." He clapped me on the shoulder, satisfied the way he always got when he thought a conversation had gone well. I watched him walk back toward the building, and I had a feeling I recognized from 36 years of being his daughter. The feeling of being managed by someone who loved me, which is its own particular kind of loneliness. Now let me tell you what was actually happening. The night before they arrived, I had made 3 calls. The first was to Ren Nakashima. I told her I'd like her to be present on the afternoon of the 4th at the brewery. I told her to bring the document package she'd prepared 6 months earlier. I told her what I expected was going to happen, and I told her I wanted to handle it with as much dignity as the situation would allow, but I needed the documentation there in case dignity wasn't an option. She said, "I'll be there." She did not ask many more questions. That's why I keep her. The second call was to Rosario. I told her that on the 4th, I was going to use the private event space on the 3rd floor for a family gathering, and that I'd like her to be present in a front-of-house capacity. I told her a little of what I expected. She nodded, which is how Rosario signals that she has processed information and is ready to act on it. The third call was to Petra. I asked her to prepare a brief overview of our production capacity and expansion plans, something she'd been working on anyway, and to have it ready for the afternoon. Petra did not know the full context, but Petra never needs full context. She is a person who prepares things to a standard of excellence regardless of the occasion, and I trusted that. I also, on the morning of the 4th, before anyone else was awake, spent 2 hours in my office on the 4th floor going through the document package one more time. The ownership structure, the deed, the chain of title, the operating agreement with my name as sole member, the SBA loan documentation showing my name and my credit and my signature, no co-signers, no family involvement. The second mortgage on my Ohio house, my house solely, which I'd already paid off years ago. 11 years of building, something the right way had produced a paper trail, so clean it looked almost too simple. The truth is almost always simpler than the story people tell themselves to complicate it. I put the folder on my desk, and I put my coffee mug on top of it, and I watched the city come awake in the morning light through 4 stories of original iron-framed glass. And I felt, for the first time in the 11 years since I'd left Ohio, completely unafraid of what my family might say. Here's how the afternoon of the 4th unfolded. I had arranged for the gathering in the 3rd floor event space at 2 o'clock, with the tap room still operating below us. I'd had a small spread set out, charcuterie, a cheese board, 6 of our best beers. The kind of spread that communicates without effort that this is a serious place run by someone who knows what she's doing. Ren arrived at 1:30, in a linen blazer with a leather portfolio, and I introduced her to my family as my business attorney, which produced a brief and interesting silence before my mother recovered and shook her hand with professional warmth. Petra was there, her overview loaded on a tablet. Rosario stood near the door with the composure of someone who has managed difficult rooms before. My family arranged themselves at the long table. My father at one end, my mother next to him with Aunt Patris beside her, legal pad in hand. Griffin and Amber across the table. Me at the other end in a chair I'd sat in for 3 years of planning and board meetings and the occasional difficult conversation, and which felt that afternoon as solid beneath me as anything I had ever sat on. My mother opened it. She always opened things. She said she wanted to start by saying how incredibly proud the family was of what I'd built here. She said it genuinely. I believe she was genuinely proud in the way that parents can be proud and calculating simultaneously, those things being not mutually exclusive. She said she thought it was a testament to the Merritt work ethic that something like this was possible. I noticed she said the Merritt work ethic, not your work ethic. The Merritt work ethic. The ownership arriving in the adjective before she'd even gotten to the proposition. She said that family was the most important thing, and that the distribution company, which my grandfather Harold had built with his own hands, was going through a difficult period, and that the family had been thinking about how the strengths that each member brought might be, here she glanced at Griffin, combined. Griffin picked it up smoothly. He'd rehearsed this. He talked about distribution infrastructure. He talked about the national market for craft beer and how a family with existing distribution relationships could be an asset to a brewery trying to scale. He talked about bringing the Merritt name to both coasts. He talked about equity. He was careful with the word. He said something like, naturally you'd want family to have a stake that reflects their contribution to future growth. He said it the way you say something you've practiced removing the threat from, which means the threat is still there, just dressed differently. My Aunt Patris, who until this point had been silent and writing on her legal pad, looked up and said that she'd been looking at the publicly disclosed numbers, and a fair structure might involve a family holding company that consolidated the distribution assets and the brewery under a single entity, with ownership percentages that reflected the original capital, meaning Harold's original investment in the distribution company as the founding family asset, and then discounted for what she called, and I want you to hear this phrase carefully, the illiquidity premium of being a solo operator without family support. I want you to hold that phrase. The illiquidity premium of being a solo operator without family support. The argument delivered in accounting language that the fact I had built this without their help was actually a discount on my ownership, that their absence was something I owed them for. I sat with it for a moment. I let the full architecture of it land. Then I looked at my mother and I said, I appreciate you all coming. I've heard what you're proposing. Before we go any further, I'd like to share something. I looked at Ren. She opened the portfolio. I had thought about how to do this moment for about 6 months, and I had made a decision early that I was not going to be dramatic. I was not going to make a speech. I was not going to produce documents with the theatrical timing of a courtroom scene. I was going to let the facts speak, and I was going to let the facts be boring, because the truth is boring and boring things are unassailable. Wren placed 3 documents on the table. Certified copies, county stamps. She said, these are the ownership documents for this property and this business. The building is held in Marlowe's name, free and clear, with no co-owners, no family liens, no outstanding encumbrances. The business is structured as a single-member LLC with Marlowe as the sole member. These documents have been in this form since the founding. No changes, no additions, no pending modifications. She set the SBA loan documents beside them. She said, this is the original business loan. Sole borrower, no co-signers, fully retired as of 2 years ago. She set the Ohio House records beside those. She said, this is the secondary financing from the founding period. A second mortgage on a property Marlowe owned personally prior to founding the brewery, also fully retired. No family capital involved at any stage of this business from founding to present. She closed the portfolio. She said, there is no family stake in this business. There has never been a family stake in this business. Any restructuring proposal that involves transferring equity from Marlowe to a family holding company is a proposal to give away something that does not belong to the family and has never belonged to the family. She said it the way she says everything, mildly, precisely, without accusation, because facts don't require accusation. They just require a flat surface and enough light. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people recalculating. My father looked at the documents. I watched him read the numbers and I watched him understand them, and I watched the understanding settle on him slowly and heavily. The way understanding settles on people who are honest enough to let it land even when it's not what they wanted. My mother's face did something more complicated. She had come here, and I believe this, I believe it was genuine. She had come here with a story she believed. The story was that this brewery was, in some essential way, an extension of the family. Built on Merritt DNA and Merritt character. That Marlowe belonged to the family, and therefore what Marlowe had built also belonged, in spirit and perhaps eventually in law, to the family. She had told herself this story for long enough that the documents on the table read to her, for a moment, not as facts but as an argument she could counter. She said, this doesn't account for all the years you spent at the company, Marlowe, all the experience you built there. That's not nothing. And here's the line I had thought about, the line I'd wanted to say for a long time, and I said it quietly, the way the quiet ones always land. Mom, the company didn't pay me enough for what I contributed. That's documented too. You not paying me what I earned doesn't give you ownership of what I built with the difference. She opened her mouth and closed it. Aunt Patris put down her legal pad. Griffin looked at the table. Not with malice, I should say. Griffin had done what Griffin always did, gone along with a plan the room had built without him, and I don't think he fully understood what he'd been part of until this moment. Griffin, for all his faults, was not a schemer. He was a person who got carried along by currents, which had been both his gift and his problem his entire life. He said, Mar, I wasn't trying to, I said, I know, Griff. And I meant it, I knew. I'd always known that my brother was not the architect of what had happened to me. He was the beneficiary of it, which is its own kind of culpability, but it's a different kind. My mother was the one who came apart, not loudly, not dramatically. Carolyn Merritt came apart the way she'd done everything her whole life, with control and dignity maintained on the surface, and something very raw visible for just a moment underneath. She said, I just don't understand how you could build something like this and not want it to be for the family. And I heard it for what it was. Not a manipulation in that moment, a genuine wound. She had a story about family as a unit, about what children owe parents and what belonging means, and that story had no room in it for the possibility that our daughter might build something magnificent and have every right to keep it for herself. I said, I wanted it for the family I'm going to build, Mom, not the one that already decided I was the one who didn't need anything. She flinched. Just slightly. The words landed where I'd aimed them, not cruelly, but accurately. I said, you always said I was the capable one, the one who could handle it, the one who'd figure it out. You were right, I figured it out. This is what I figured out. And I figured it out alone because when I needed the family in my corner, the family had already decided it only had room for one of us and it wasn't going to be me. My father said quietly, that's fair. My mother looked at him quickly. The look of a woman whose ally has just become a witness. My father said, still quietly, still looking at the documents on the table, Carolyn, she's right. We handled things wrong. My mother said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, I always thought you were okay, Marlowe. I always thought you were okay. And I want to tell you, I felt only triumph in that moment. I didn't. I felt the sad, complicated tenderness of a person who has spent 36 years wanting a different mother than the one she got, and who has finally arrived at the understanding that this is the one she has, and she is neither a monster nor a saint, and she loves me in the limited and conditional way she has always loved me, and that love is real even though it was never enough. I said, I know you thought that. That was the problem. The rest of the afternoon did not resolve cleanly because real life doesn't resolve cleanly. Aunt Patris excused herself with a dignity I respected and left her legal pad on the table, face down. Rosario quietly offered to bring more coffee. Griffin went downstairs to the tap room, and I found out later from Rosario that he sat at the bar for an hour by himself and drank one of our pale ales with the specific concentration of a man thinking through things he should have thought through earlier. My father asked if he could look at the production floor. I walked him through it myself, just the two of us, while Petra ran the afternoon crew and pretended very professionally not to notice us. He asked good questions. He had always asked good questions about operations. It was where he and I were most alike, and where my childhood had been most visible to him and least acknowledged. At the bottom of the stairs, by the fermentation tanks, he stopped and looked at the scale of it and he said, "This is a hell of a thing you built, sweetheart." And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I want to tell you that was enough. It wasn't enough. It was real and it mattered and it was not enough, and both of those things are true simultaneously." I said, "Thanks, Dad." He nodded. We walked back upstairs. My mother came to find me before they left in the late afternoon, the tap room filling up below us with the holiday crowd and the sound of a good business running itself. She found me on the fourth floor landing, leaning on the railing, looking down at the tanks. She said, "I love you." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I know that's not." "I know it's not." I said, "I know." She put her hand on my arm. She said, "Will you call?" I said, "On Sundays." She nodded. She went downstairs. I stood on the landing for a while after they left, listening to the taproom below. The hum of a full house on a holiday, 40 taps, 120 seats, the specific noise of a place that had found its people and was feeding them well. Then Petra called up from the production floor with a question about the conditioning room temperature, and I went back to work. Because the work doesn't wait. The work never waits. And I have come to understand that about myself. The work is where I live. The work is what I built when I had nothing else. And the work, it turned out, was enough. Here is where things stand, a little over a year later. My mother calls on Sundays. The calls are shorter than they used to be and more honest, which I count as progress. She asks about the brewery with genuine curiosity now, not the assessing interest she brought to the 4th of July weekend, but something simpler and closer to real. I tell her about the new seasonal releases and the collaboration we did with a farm up in Whatcom County, and the write-up in the national publication last fall. She says she's proud of me. I believe her more than I used to. My father and I have a different relationship than we had before the 4th. He retired from the distribution company 6 months ago. Griffin is running it, and from what I hear, doing a reasonable job. The relational skills that always made him my father's first choice have turned out to be genuinely valuable in the current environment. And Griffin has had the sense to hire an operations director who is meticulous in the way that Griffin is not. I have watched my brother grow from a distance into a version of himself that is better than the version I grew up resenting. I find that I am glad for it, and I don't examine that gladness too closely because some things are easier to accept when you stop prodding them. I do not regret what happened on the 4th. I want to be clear about that. Not because I enjoyed it, I didn't, not the way people sometimes imagine you enjoy a reversal. I didn't gloat. I didn't play it for theater. I just let the documents be what they were and let the room be what it was, and the truth did its work without my help. But I am aware that the clean ending of stories like this one, the moment when the gate closes and the car drives away and the person is finally free, that's not quite how it goes in real life. In real life, the people are still your people, damaged and limited and real, and the freedom you build isn't freedom from them. It's freedom from the story they told about you. Those are different things, and the difference matters. Petra made partner last year. It was not a decision I made lightly or quickly, and I want to tell you why. For 4 years, I had been the sole owner of this business with a fierceness that I eventually recognized had roots that had nothing to do with business strategy. I had owned it alone because the experience of watching my own labor slowly absorbed into someone else's identity had made me, perhaps understandably, protective to the point of pathology. I had built a life and a company that were entirely mine. And I held onto the entirely mine part long past the point where it was strategically wise, because I had confused financial independence with the need to never be vulnerable again, which are very different things. And the confusion was costing me in ways I could measure and ways I couldn't. Ren told me in one of our quarterly planning sessions that I was leaving growth on the table because I was unwilling to bring in partners who could help the business expand in ways that my solo ownership was limiting. She said it mildly, the way she says everything, and she was right about it. So when Petra told me she'd been offered a head brewer position at a well-funded competitor, and I sat with the feeling of this building without Petra in it, I understood something. The thing I'd been protecting was not the building or the equity. It was the proof. The proof that I could do it alone. I had the proof. I didn't need to keep generating it at the cost of everything else. We negotiated a partnership structure over 3 months. 20% stake, vesting over 5 years. Ren drafted it, precise and airtight. We signed it on a Thursday morning in November, in my office on the 4th floor, with a glass of the barrel-aged stout we'd been conditioning for 8 months, which had by then turned into something that made Petra's eyes close briefly when she tasted it, the way they do when she encounters something that meets her standard. She said, "This is the best thing we've ever made." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I want to enter it in the national competition." I said, "I know. We entered it. We won." The grain mill is 5 years old now as a going concern, and it looks different than it did in year one in all the ways that matter and the same in all the ways that matter more. The bones are unchanged. The original brick, the iron windows, the old-growth timber floors worn smooth by decades before I ever arrived. Petra's fermentation tanks, 14 of them now. Rosario's taproom, busier on a Tuesday than we used to be on a Friday. The thing about the building, the thing I noticed the morning after the 4th of July, standing at the 4th floor window with my coffee, is that it looked exactly the same as it had looked the morning before. The crisis that had been building in my family's imagination for months had landed, and the documents had been what they were, and the building was still there. 4 stories of reclaimed brick in the morning light, unchanged. That's what it felt like to own something fully, not the triumph of the reveal, not the drama of the reversal. The morning after, and the building's still there, still yours, still asking you to go down and do the work. I went down and did the work. Here's what I've come to understand about the strong one, the capable one, the one who will figure it out. The families that do this, and there are more of them than you'd think. The evidence piles up in comment sections on stories like this one. They are not usually doing it out of cruelty. They are doing it out of a shortage of imagination. They look at one child and see someone who needs things, and they look at another child and see someone who produces things, and they organize the family around that division as though it were natural, as though it were physics. What they don't understand is that the child who produces things needs things too. Needs them just as badly, possibly more, because she has spent years being told that needing things is a failure of the role she was assigned. She needs to be seen. She needs to be celebrated. She needs someone to cancel something for her once, just once, not because there's a crisis, but because her presence is worth the sacrifice. I didn't get that from my family. I built a brewery instead. I don't know that the trade was worth it exactly. I know the brewery is extraordinary, and I know what it cost, and I know that some of what it cost was not financial. Some of what it cost was 11 years in a city where no one had known me since before I was capable. 11 years building a table from scratch, because the one I'd been assigned a seat at had turned out not to have my name on it. But here is what I know now that I didn't know at 25. The people who show up are worth 10 of the people who should. The people who stay are worth 10 of the people who had to. Petra, who drove 4 hours for an interview and stayed. Rosario, who built the taproom culture that makes strangers feel like regulars. The clients, the neighbors, the friends I made in a city I chose for myself rather than one I was born into. The point is the people. The people who were there not because they shared my last name, but because they showed up, stayed, and built something alongside me. That's what I have now. That's what I built under the Merritt name and beyond it, and finally past it, in a converted grain mill in a city on the other side of the country from everything I used to think I was. And on Sunday mornings, I walk the production floor before anyone else arrives, and I listen to the building breathe, The fermentation tanks cycling, the building settling into its old bones, the city waking up outside the iron-framed windows, and I feel the specific quiet of a place that is exactly what it was always supposed to be. I didn't inherit this. I built it. My grandfather Harold had a line he was apparently famous for. A line my father told me once when I was young and that I didn't fully understand until I'd worked 11 years for the right to agree with it. Harold used to say, "You want to know what someone is worth? Look at what they built after the door closed." The door closed on me at 25 in a Tuesday afternoon meeting with no agenda on the calendar. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen for 4 hours. I started going to a homebrew club on Thursday nights. Look at what I built after. That's my story. One meeting that closed a door. 11 years of building the room behind it. And an afternoon in July when I got to stand in that room and let the facts be what they were in front of witnesses on solid ground, while my family broke themselves against the truth of what I'd built and who I'd become without them. If you're the strong one right now, the capable one, the one they've decided doesn't need anything, I want you to hear this. The thing that makes you load-bearing in someone else's story is the same thing that makes you capable of building your own. They told you it was a description. It's actually a set of tools. Pick them up. Walk out the door. Go build something worth fighting for. And when the family comes to claim it, let the documents be ready and let the room be full of honest people, and let the truth arrive in the flat, quiet, unassailable voice of a well-prepared attorney with a county stamp on the page. That's the whole thing. Not noise. Not cruelty. Just facts standing in the light in front of people who cannot unsee them. If this story found you tonight, please subscribe so the next one does too. Drop a comment with one thing you built after a door closed on you. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.